I'm ready.
What's up, everybody? It's Demetrius here from Clair Em Motivators with Anika, also with Clair Em Motivators. And if this is your first time watching our video, welcome. I'm an attorney and a life coach. Anika is a physician and a health coach. And we started doing these videos a couple months ago just to help talk about topics that were important to us, give people some information, and just give people something to watch. As we all kind of battle with the pandemic. It is 2021 now. Can you believe it?
Yes, it is. It feels the same as 2020, but it is 2021.
Nothing changed literally, but at the beginning of the year, people typically go in with like New Year's resolutions, or they feel like the beginning of the year is a fresh start for them to tackle some things. And so I thought it was appropriate for the topic of today's video for people who are struggling with forgiveness to go into 2021 with some helpful information about how to work through some things that they may be holding on to. And so we'll jump into that in a minute. But first, the cup. And what we do is I'll pull a question out. And the question is essentially, which of the two choices would motivate you most right now? So today's what would motivate you most is what would motivate you most right now? Going on a cruise with your friends or going to outer space with your spouse?
I am going to say outer space with my spouse.
Why?
Well, because you said cruise with your friends, and I'm thinking I love my friends, and a cruise probably the way 2020 was is probably not the smartest thing in the world to
Oh,
do.
COVID?
Yeah, because of COVID. And then I sometimes I have felt, what if I could just escape it all and just like go live on an island? So outer space is not an island, but I think it'll do. So I'm going to go out of space.
And I'm jumping all over that answer with you. I think I've texted you before, like, how much do you think tickets to Mars?
Yeah.
Because last year was so crazy. And sometimes just dealing with like worldly stuff in general,
Yeah.
okay, there has to be somewhere else where they
Yep. I'm with you. So let's go find out together. We can hop on and go out of space.
my kids too. I don't want to just leave
Well,
with my
you
spouse.
know what? I'm gonna leave mine with you, and then I'll call for him if outer space is good.
But that's a good point. I can leave my 4-year-old and my about to be 3-year-old tomorrow with your kids. And then
Yeah.
we can go, oh, can we come to your outer space too? Or would you like, no, y'all can't come?
I don't know, No, you can come to my outer space. You can come
Okay,
to my
so
outer
the
space.
four of us are going to get away for a little bit and go to outer space, and then we'll come back. And
Maybe.
right, we
Or
come
or we'll stay and start calling down for some people to come up there.
back. Right. Look down and be like, okay, they got it together yet? No, all right, we're gonna stay up here a little bit longer. Um, I we started talking about this topic after our video on how to apologize, because it came up that like you can't hold on to stuff forever, and at some point if you get an apology, was the way it came up in that video, you have to get to a space where you're able to like not continue to bring stuff up anymore. And so I wanted to talk about forgiveness, because I think that's an area of life that a lot of people struggle with, in an area of life that everybody's going to experience, right? Like, we're Christian and everybody is a sinner. And you are going to have things happen to you, or you're going to do things to somebody where forgiveness is going to be necessary. And so, one of the things that I would like to start with was just like, what does forgiveness actually mean to you? I can go first.
Um, yeah, it doesn't matter whichever way.
Oh, go ahead.
With forgiveness for me, and I know this sounds cliche, but that saying you can forgive, but not forget. So I don't think that forgiveness erases your memory. It really is letting go of the pain. Because when I say forgiveness, that means something I perceived was done to me wrong. Letting go of that pain, not necessarily forgetting it, but letting it go for myself so that I can move past whatever pain it is.
Yeah. So obviously, I think, like I said, we're Christian. Everybody knows the concept of forgiveness from the Bible. But I think that one thing that's hard for people sometimes is to translate that into like, okay, I experienced this. What does that type of like godly forgiveness look like in my everyday life? And I agree with you. I think forgiveness in my mind is synonymous with healing. And to me, it means not necessarily forgetting it, but getting to a place where you are no longer triggered by it, or even if you are, because of the things that I've learned from the work that I do, working with victims of like sexual abuse and domestic violence and things like that, a lot of people are going to go through the rest of their lives being triggered by things that were done to them. But the difference is when you start talking about healing is how does that then impact you? Do you get angry? Are you still living in rage? Are you still holding on to bitterness and resentment? Is it still affecting how you see yourself? Is it still affecting your relationships? Or are you able to, once that feeling is triggered where you're like, man, I remember when so and so did this to me, you're able to work through it where you're not reacting out of anger and hurt and shame and guilt and all of these things. So that's just kind of the way that I see it. And I think that the next question that I had was what are some misconceptions that you think people have about forgiveness? And I'll start with that one because what I was about to say is I think the thing that's helpful to understand is one, that forgiveness is a choice. I think a lot of times people who have maybe done the wrong thing like feel entitled to your forgiveness, or you may feel like you have to forgive somebody because that is what, as a society, we kind of believe, oh, you got to forgive people and you got to move on and you can't hold on to that. But I think that you start from the place of like forgiveness is a choice, and I think that the choice is the beginning of the process. Just saying, I want to forgive this person. Like that's just step one. And I feel like a lot of the ways that it comes up when things happen is like that's kind of the end where you're like, okay, I forgive you. And then that's it. But the other misconception that I think people have is that it's like that, like you say it and then it's done. When I actually believe that forgiveness is a process, and you may not necessarily arrive at a place where you are ever fully like not thinking about it anymore. So I think that, like I said, it's the choice to say I would like to forgive, and it's understanding that even that is a process, and that that is going to involve some peaks and some valleys, especially if you're talking about some of the more serious things like forgiving, maybe infidelity for some couples, or betrayal, like things like that, where you really were harmed by something that somebody did, whether that be, from infidelity, or that's the only example I can think of. That it is a choice and it's a process. Like you don't get over stuff that happens like that overnight. But I don't know, what do you think are some misconceptions, or what comments do you have about that?
So I think one of the ones is just forgiveness is letting the person off the hook. I think sometimes you forget
That's
that you are, yeah, it's a misconception that if I'm forgive you, if I say I forgive you, then I'm letting you off easy per se. But I think we miss the concept that you're actually forgiving another for yourself,
right.
because it's you that's benefiting from that forgiveness. As you said, I am letting this go. I'm working through the process so that this does not, I'm not carrying this with me, or I'm not building up a grudge. And so forgiving somebody is not is letting them off of the hook. Like I say, forgiveness is actually an action to me that you are doing for yourself.
Yeah, and I actually saw this quote not too long ago. When you think about some of the things that not forgiving leaves with you, like the resentment, the anger, the bitterness, those types of feelings, the quote said that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And I was like, that's so true, because it is. It's
Mhm.
like you're sitting around festering in your anger, festering in your resentment and your bitterness and all of these things. And it's holding you back in your life. It's affecting your relationships. It's causing depression. It's causing anxiety. You don't trust people anymore, or whatever it is. And the other person is living their best life. They're not thinking about what they did to you. They have moved on from it. And so you're right in that, a misconception is that you forgive them to let them off the hook, or you forgive them to give them a pass, when it really is like you forgive so that you can have inner peace, and you forgive so that you can set yourself free.
Yeah, one of the other ones too. I think the best piece of advice that I was given, and it's funny the context that this came in because we were not necessarily even talking about. I can't even remember what it was that we were talking about, but one of the statements that that one of and it's one of my physician partners that I was working with at the time. She said forgiveness does not require presence, and so that's one misconception that I think we have is that let's say I'm in a relationship, not with a friend, and I no longer want to be, I don't necessarily want the relationship, but I do want to forgive her so that I can move on and be fruitful and let go so that I'm not left with resentment. But that forgiveness does not require presence. That forgiveness does not require that I have to keep the relationship going. I may not want to keep the relationship going, but I can still forgive. So that's one, like I said, that's one that stuck with me with her saying it's just forgiveness does not require presence.
Yeah, and I mean the same for me. It's like I use reconciliation instead of presence. It's the same thing though. Like just because I forgive you, that doesn't mean that we have to repair or reconcile the relationship. If it's something that happened that you feel like, you know what, this is a no go, no deal on this. I can't continue to be in this relationship. Then that's okay. And I think that sometimes people feel guilty about that because they feel like, well, maybe I haven't done forgiveness right, or maybe I haven't actually forgiven if I feel like I no longer want to be around that person. And what we're saying is that's not true. You can get to the place where you absolutely forgive somebody for what they did, and you decide that their presence in your life is not okay. For me, I remember having a conversation with mom not too long ago where I was explaining to her about a family member. I'm like, you know what? I have forgiven them, but I don't like them. I don't like her. I don't want
Yep.
to have a relationship with her because I see that she hasn't changed. And so it's like, yes, she acknowledged, yes, she apologized, but she hasn't changed her behavior. So I would be a fool to re-engage in that relationship knowing that the result is going to be the same. And so, there is a second, especially as a Christian, where you feel like, well, have I prayed hard enough? Have I forgiven enough? And it's like, I am at peace with knowing I forgive you. I am not upset by the things that you did, the things that you said. But like you said, that forgiveness doesn't then require me to extend presence. You don't get a seat at my table. You've already given up that opportunity. Um, and I think you've addressed this already about like why it's important to forgive. And it really is to have that sense of peace and freedom that you're not carrying around um, those things that are harmful to you. You just said something about like the presence. And one thing that I realize is the process of forgiving somebody looks very different based on if there's going to be reconciliation or not. Right. And I think that a lot of times people will say, well, in order for me to forgive, I have to have an apology. I have to have an acknowledgement. I have to have closure. Like I need there to be some addressing of what actually happened. And I think that for me, I think the definition of forgiveness that I use is while those things may be nice, those things are not a requirement to forgiveness. So, do you think that in order for you to forgive, say somebody that you're going to maintain a relationship with, that requires acknowledgement, um, a closure, or some acknowledgement and reconciling of what actually happened? Or do you think you could forgive somebody if they never did any of those things?
So, the funny thing is that yes, you can forgive somebody if that never happens. That is one that I often will struggle with myself because I feel like if, especially in a relationship you're going to maintain, in a relationship that you will not have again, it doesn't matter if you acknowledged it. It doesn't matter if you said something about it. It doesn't matter because the relationship is not one that I even have, but it's one that, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate because sometimes with family, we cannot, if something may happen with someone in your family and it's not so easy to kind of cut those relationships off because this may be a family member that this can be a sister, a brother, this can be a parent. And so in those type relationships, I'm not going to be able to walk away from this. And so those are very hard. Those are very hard. But you, just like what we've saying, is you have to kind of work through that process. And it's going to be a process because you are going to continue to see this person. But if you do not get that acknowledgement, if you don't get that, it's validation of your feelings to say that they even hurt you in the first place, it is still important to forgive. Now, I am going to admit, I'm not going to sit here and say it's not harder to forgive, because I would be lying, because it is harder to forgive when you have to see this person and they have yet to even acknowledge whatever wrongdoing it is. So yes, it is hard. It can be done, but it is, I like I say, I'm not going to lie, it is going to be difficult, but it's a process that you're going to have to kind of work through.
Right. Since you brought up the process, I actually think that a part of the process of forgiveness is processing the way that you feel about it, right? It's not talking yourself out of it. Um, it's this book that I'm reading that actually is this lady that was talking about how she covered her pain in religion. And so anytime she would start to feel sad, she'd be like, well, I'm just going to pray about it. Jesus got me, but never actually took the time to say, well, how do I feel about this? What has triggered me today? Why am I upset in this moment? Why does the sight of them, make me want to vomit? Like really sitting and going through the process. One, understanding, like you said, you may never get the acknowledgement from them, but I think you can acknowledge and validate yourself, or find a safe person or a friend to be able to talk to, right? So say it's a shared family member for both of us because we're in the same family. If I know you're a safe person, I can call you and say, hey, you know what? Me seeing her today really made me feel like this. And you and I can sit and acknowledge and validate the way that we feel about it, but that person never knowing or having experienced it. Or maybe, in certain families, you don't have that safe person. Get a journal and write it down, like actually process instead of talking yourself out of it, giving yourself the motivational quotes to just mask it, just like it's going to be all right. I've been through that. I can get through anything. It's like, no, this hurt. This made
Mm-hmm.
me sad. I'm still upset about this. It's been 15 years and today a flood of emotions came back about it. And journal it. If you're not a person who writes, everybody got a cell phone and most everybody's cell phone has a voice recorder on there. Sit there and talk to the voice recorder to say, like, this is how I felt about it. Because a lot of these emotions are, they need to be processed. You can't just, they're not supposed to sit and reside in you. They're supposed to be processed through. But if you never acknowledge them, the person who did it never acknowledges them, they're going to go somewhere. And where they're going to go is resentment, bitterness, anger. And so until you sit and say, you know what, like you said, first of all, this is hard. And then second of all, like, this is actually what I'm feeling. It's going to be very difficult to do. And so I say that because I think a lot of times people give advice like, oh, it's going to be hard, but you can do it. And the person who's experienced it is like, how? How do I get up? How do I get past this? How do I let this go? And for me, even when I hear people say like, oh, you got to let it go, I'm like, no, you have to work through it. You can't just like
Yeah.
pick it up and set it free like a butterfly. It doesn't work like that. You have to work through it. And I think understanding that there are going to be some days that it might come back. You might have a dream, you know what I'm saying? And where you're like, you wake up and you look around like, oh, that was just a dream. And so until you're able to work through those emotions and understand that all of this stuff, when you talk about healing and health and stuff like that, anxiety, depression, it's a journey. It's not something that's like a switch that you just flip off one day and you're like, okay, I'm healed and everything is forgiven. It's like, no, it's a journey and it's going to be with you. And you just have to learn some tools to be able to work through it. And my favorite that I give to people is to journal it or to find a safe person or both to talk about it, so that you can actually process through, what it is. Another tip that I would have is to establish boundaries. So I think you make this distinction too. If it's somebody that you have to see, that forgiveness between them is going to look very different than
Mm-hmm.
somebody that you have completely cut off that you're never going to see again. Those you tend to forget about because time, you're like, oh, I ain't seen this person in forever. But the constant reminders, um, I think those are the hardest, but I think boundaries are extremely important. And you learning to protect your energy, right? If you have to avoid certain spaces because you know that person's going to be there. And back to what I was saying earlier, I think a lot of times people can make you feel like, well, if you have to do that, then you haven't really
Yeah.
forgiven. And I just don't think that's true. I think that it's like, yes, I have forgiven them, but I also have to protect my energy. Like that person hasn't changed. I've done the work on my end to work through it. I've done the work on my end to forgive, but they're still the same. So in my mind, it's not logical to think that you have to continue opening yourself up or exposing yourself to their same behavior. And so I think, like I said, if you can avoid spaces where they are, then do that. If it's a family function and you got to sit at one table and you know if they come in the kitchen, you need to leave, then that's fine too. But I don't know. What do you think?
No, that's absolutely true because, and I feel the same way too. It goes back to with me saying that forgiveness does not require presence, and that's the thing is and if presence doesn't have to be physical presence, but it can be presence in my life, presence in my space.
Yeah.
Yes, presence in my space. It doesn't have to be it can be a figurative presence. So this is a relationship. This is not a relationship that I want, but it's also not one I can get rid of. You have to understand sometimes a person has to forgive their mom, and I may not be to where I've cut my mom out of my life, or it's my dad or my sister, my brother, my cousin, my father-in-law, sister-in-law, mother-in-law. So sometimes these relationships are not relationships that I can just walk out of. And so
Out.
that
People like, well, I would just leave or whatever. And it's like, this in terms of the parents and stuff too, it's like it's not always that simple where you're just gonna be able to walk away from situations that may be harmful. But
Yeah, absolutely. Because think about, okay, let's say, if a person mom, let's say it's a daughter and a mom that just not we've never really gotten along. We it's just a relationship that can be, I don't want to toxic, it can be toxic. I am trying to kind of work through, but like you said, this person is not going to change and will never change. But I don't want to cut my mom out of my life. And I'm not talking about my mom. So my mom, I'm not talking about you. I'm just using it as
right,
an example. But I can't cut my mom out of my life because what would that do to my kids? You know what I'm saying? So this is a relationship that I didn't choose, but it's also a relationship that I don't want to just cut off, but it is one that I don't want it in this context. And so it does not have to be forced upon me, and I can forgive this person for some of the things that may have happened along our relationship. I can forgive this person that we don't have a relationship, so that I can forgive this person, but not be in the space. I don't have to be forced to be in a space. This person does not have to be in my figurative space in order for me to in order for it, you say, okay, well, you haven't forgive them because you don't have a relationship. I don't want one. And I have forgiven them.
right. Two things can be true, like we always say, right? Like I've forgiven them and I also don't want them in my life. But like I think the biggest thing that everybody can do when we're talking about those relationships where the presence is still going to be there is to speak up for yourself and to establish boundaries. Because if you know that this person is still continue, because I think a lot of times people get let off the hook in the sense that you're upset, you're going to do all this inner work to try to work through how you feel and forgive, but you haven't set up any parameters that prevents you from continuously being hurt in the same way. And so, if it's a parent, for to use your example, and you feel like they don't respect you, they don't respect your marriage, for example, and they're always showing up at your house, you have to speak up for yourself and establish that boundary that, like, hey, you are not allowed to come to my house unannounced. And if you do, I'm not letting you in. Right. Like, I think that now, obviously, everybody's situation is different. Like, if you living in their old house and they paying your mortgage and she gonna stop paying your mortgage, that matters. But I'm just using that as an example to say that, just because this person is going to stay in your life, it doesn't mean that they get to keep violating you in the same way. And so if it's a spouse, even you get to say, for example, I know somebody whose husband was doing stuff that she wasn't okay with. And you have to say, like, look, you going to wherever by yourself with somebody that you work with, I'm not okay with that. I know your friends do that in their marriage, but I'm not okay with that in this marriage. Like, you have to speak up for yourself and establish those boundaries and have people respect them, because if not, it'll be hard to maintain that forgiveness because you keep being violated.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
So it's and we were talking about this earlier, and I actually talked to mom earlier too, because I'm like, forgiveness is it's one of those words like love or happy that is just like, you hear these words and you think, oh, I know what that means. But then as you get older and you mature and life happens to you, you're like, wait, but do I really though? And forgiveness is such a broad concept that it's hard to kind of nail down. But like I said, the tips that we wanted to just give people were that, one, it's something that everybody struggles with. that too, like, don't feel guilty and don't beat yourself up, and you get to decide for you what forgiveness look like. Because I think sometimes you can watch some of the motivational speeches or you can read some of the self-help books, and it can make you feel more guilty. One that I actually was doing some research earlier, and I read this one passage from somebody who's pretty popular that said for them, one of the parts of forgiveness is you trying to understand and empathize with why the person hurt you. And I'm like, oh, that sounds right.
Yeah, but that's gonna be tough
The
to do.
world that I live in, right? Like I am literally working with women who have been sexually abused. I'm
Yeah,
not empathizing with why you did that to me.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
it's like I said, some of the one size fits all advice, if you are dealing with something and you are struggling with it, and that piece of information does not serve your life, you got to have some discernment to be like, yeah, no, I'm not empathizing with the person who.
yeah. I don't know that I agree with that because sometimes, some people have, because when we're talking about forgiveness, please understand there are levels to all of this. I may be forgiving somebody for stepping on my foot. That's a lot different than forgiving somebody for molesting me as a child. That's a lot different. And so yeah, I don't know that I can. First of all, I'm trying to work through the process of forgiving in the first place, and then I'm adding in empathy as to why you did what you did when only you can answer that in the first place. So I don't know.
Anything, right? Like, why
Yeah,
you did this to me? While it may insert, take a parent, for example, you may kind of say, well, I know now as an adult, like why my parents did
yeah,
what they did, but I'm still hurt, right? Like I'm
yeah,
focusing on the impact and trying to work through that. And that piece of advice, I was like, no. And I've actually seen that more than one time where it's like, you got to understand that they're dealing with something and they're just hurt, and it kind of shifts the light back to them, which is like, yes, those statements are true. People hurt you when they are hurt, but I think your recovery doesn't necessarily have to involve processing their hurt, right? Like that's,
yeah,
hopefully they're sitting somewhere processing their own hurt. That's not your burden to carry. So to me, that goes to one of those misconceptions that, like, okay, let me try to understand why they did this to me, because there are some things that will happen that you will never understand. Like
oh
I
yeah,
never
absolutely.
understand why you made the decisions that you made. I don't want to understand.
Hmm.
But I think, we've pretty much covered a lot of the stuff where it's like, you may not always get closure. You may not always get acknowledgement. You may not always get an apology. I actually think those things are probably more rare than actually getting them. And I think sometimes people hope for that conversation to get acknowledged and validated, to be like, oh, if I could just talk to whomever and I could get all this out. But I think sometimes that's romanticized, because you think you're gonna say this and then they're gonna apologize and cry and y'all gonna hug. And you might know some people that's gonna double down on doing what they did to hurt you in the first place and then make it all your fault. And then now you stuck. And so for me, that's
Yeah,
that forgiveness can't be based on nobody else but you.
yeah. I was gonna say to kind of even take it a step above that and blow your mind is that sometimes, especially in a year like 2020, where there was so much death, somebody may be having to forgive God. It's just to say, and so all of that, what you just said, acknowledgement, apology, that's not words that is necessarily like God's not going to call you on the phone and said, hey, I did this because I'm sorry, because you're not going to get that. But that's a process that you're going to work through. And you may ask, why God? Why did I lose 5 members of my family to COVID in 2020? But I'm still going to work through that forgiveness. And so people, we are not walking around God. But like I say, just to use an example, that's one where that may be what I'm trying to forgive. And I'm not going to get any of what you just said.
Right. And
So
this is actually a quote from Sex and the City. I don't know if you watched that movie, but people who watch Sex and the City, there was a scene on the movie where Carrie and Miranda, who were friends, started talking about forgiveness. And one of the friends was trying to get the other one to like forgive her husband. And she was like, well, you're talking about me and you haven't forgiven so and so for what he did. And the person ended up saying, like, forgiveness is forgiveness. Like, you're trying to make a distinction between our,
yeah.
but you haven't forgiven somebody and you're trying to tell me to, when ultimately, regardless, biblically, regardless of what the sin is, the forgiveness is the same. The process is the same.
Yeah.
Part of forgiving God, I think that's a big one. And then also people forgiving themselves. I think people
Yeah.
live in shame and guilt about maybe decisions that they made when they didn't know any better, or them wishing that they did know better, or maybe them making some decisions, that led to something happening to somebody else. And when you start talking about that, forgiving God, forgiving yourself, forgiving people, for those deep hurts, it is hard to do. But like you
Oh,
said,
yeah.
can be done. You just have to be willing to acknowledge it. And it's so crazy because I feel like all of the tips videos that we get, it starts with self-awareness and acknowledgement. Pretty much everything that we've talked about. It's
Yeah.
like it starts with you being aware enough to know, hey, I'm carrying some stuff that I probably need to deal with. You acknowledging that, and then that being step one. That's the hardest step.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
And then just understanding, like I said, that it's a process. And I think that the reason why it's not talked about in this way is because it don't sound fun, right? We have
Mm-mm.
things sound happy and
Sounds like a lot of work.
exciting. You want to give people hope that like they're not going to be feeling this pain forever. And so when somebody comes along and they're like, yeah, you may still hurt randomly 10 years from now, I was like, oh, I might want to hear that. But it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
you deal with people who are experiencing depression and anxiety, and some of that stuff is connected to something that happened when they were 10 and they 40.
Yeah.
But I think that people fighting against that, trying to like, why is this not going away? I want this to stop. And yeah, no, that's not how your brain works. That's not how life
Yeah.
works. And it doesn't sound great. We can't put this as a title of a book and sell it to people because it's not, an easy pill to swallow. But it is one that I think you have to accept that it is hard to do. But making that step and choosing it, just choosing to say, I do not want to be captive to this anymore. And I want to let it go. Step one, and then you just kind of take the baby steps to get through it. And I think, especially in a relationship that you're gonna still maintain, that other person understand and respect that it's a process, right? You say, look, I forgive you, but I'm still working through some stuff. And so, we just gonna have to deal with it. But because this is how it came up in the last video, I did want to ask you this. Um, I think you're the one who mentioned that, like, once you do make that decision to forgive somebody, that you can't keep bringing it up. So
Yeah.
I want to talk more about that.
Yeah. And it's you. So I have forgiven you. And I kind of just feel like, because when we were talking about the apology video, how we were saying, how many times do you have to apologize, and it's until a person forgives you. But I feel like once I have worked through the process, once I have forgiven, it's not okay when I get upset to then bring up what it was that I have forgiven, because I don't think that you have forgiven if I have to do that. If every time I something well, I remember when you did this, I forgive you for it, but then the moment I get mad at you, I bring it up again. So that's not forgiveness. You haven't quite completed the process if I have to keep bringing it up
Right.
each time.
And what I will say to what I was saying earlier, it's like, just because you have forgiven somebody, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're never going to think about it again. But thinking about it and bringing it back up in an argument because you're mad are two completely different things. And that's why I said journal and voice record, because it may be something that you really do in that moment. You feel like, oh, I forgave you for this, and you coming to talk to me about, and so I
Yeah.
those minds go there. But like you said, for a relationship to move forward, any relationship, if you're still stuck in the past and you're using that as leverage, you're obviously being triggered by it to the point where you are still upset, then you just still have some more processing to do, because it is unfair to the other person that,
Hmm.
I've done my part, I've acknowledged, I've validated, we worked through some stuff, and it's been 2, 3, 4 years, not to put a number on anybody's process, but just as an example, it's been 2 years, we talking about something not even related to that, and you like you said, oh yeah, well, what about that time you did this? It's like, no, that's not, that's unfair to the person who
Yeah.
has done the work to say, you know what, I apologize, I acknowledged, I validated, I've done my part. You got to do your part. But again, just to, say, that doesn't mean that you're not ever going to think about that again. That just means you need to go write that down or call your
When
safety.
it comes up.
Like,
Yeah.
today that really made me think about that one time when I was little, when so and so did such and such, and you'd be like, yeah, girl, that's crazy, I can't believe that happened. And then we move on. But I'm not, still constantly bringing up, well, that's why, you did this to me. So I think if you haven't learned from our videos or from following our pages, that we just really genuinely encourage people to learn the tools needed to live their best life. Like 2020, if nothing else, showed so much despair in so many different ways that we, because of what you do for a living and what I do for a living, we already knew existed, but it was literally a magnifying glass put on it. And like Anika said, you know, we're not talking about nothing that we haven't experienced. We're not talking about nothing that, you know, every human being has struggled with forgiveness or at least had to, you know, try to reconcile how they feel about it. And so, if nothing else, what we want you guys to take away is that you are not alone in your struggles and trying to work through them. And if you need to reach out to a professional, please do so. Because I think everybody is entitled to and has a right to live a whole, happy, full, prosperous life. I don't care who you are, where you come from, none of the demographics. I feel like, not to get preachy, but I feel like God has promised us that, and we are all entitled to that. And so, if there are things that we can do to live God's promise, then we need to be able to do those. And so, and I think sometimes just hearing other people say, like, yeah, I've struggled with forgiveness, makes somebody who's listening go, oh, okay, well, it's not just me. I don't
Mhm.
have to, you know, reconcile, or I don't have to go to my grandma's house if I don't want to, because, you know, and it's under giving people permission to feel what they feel and acknowledging them and validating, like, hey, you're not alone and you're not wrong. Um, can be very deeply healing. But that's all I have. Do you have anything else?
No, nope. On that note, that was a good last word.
Well, we hope that you guys are doing okay. Like we said, starting off the new year, a lot of people are focusing on how to be better, how to improve their lives. And one area that everybody can start with is letting go of those things that are causing you rage and anger and resentment by acknowledging them, working through them, and choosing forgiveness as a path to peace.
Amen.
And with that, we will see you guys next week for our next Motivation Monday video. Y'all have a good week. Bye.
Bye.